Sunday's lesson. With that in mind. The monarchy of David and Solomon, first paragraph, the monarchy of David and Solomon represents the golden age in Israel's history. But what if David and Solomon did not exist, as some have claimed? What if their kingdom was not as extensive as the Bible describes, as some have also claimed? Without David, there would be no Jerusalem, and the capital of the nation. Without David, there would be no temple built by his son Solomon. Finally, without David, there would be no future Messiah, for it is through the line of David that the Messiah is promised. Israelite history would need to be completely rewritten. Yet that history, as it reads in Scripture, is precisely what gives Israel and the church its unique role and mission. So first thing I want to point out, now they list this as the golden age in Israel's history. Thought about that. The so-called golden age. This golden age, was this God's plan for Israel? Or was God working plan B because his plan A, Israel, the people, rejected? Well, if you're not sure, I will read out of 1 Samuel 8, 10 through 22. Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will do. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50, and others will to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariot. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take a tenth of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants, your men servant and maid servants, and the best of your cattle and donkey he will use for his own use. He will take a tenth of your flock, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." But the people refused to listen to Samuel. "No," they said, "we want a king over us. Then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles." When Samuel heard all the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. The Lord answered him, "Listen to them and give them a king." Now, multiple things come to mind. This is the golden age? Multiple things come to my mind as I read this. Do we hear this as a standalone story? Or do we see it as part of a larger reality, the great controversy, man fallen into sin, God working to bring salvation, Satan working to corrupt humanity and obstruct the plan of salvation, the coming Messiah? What do we see? What did God describe would be the result of their request? It's right there. A ruling elite, monarchy, aristocracy, in which the ruling elite exploits the people for the benefit of the aristocracy. Whose form of government is this? This is Satan's form of government. Through all human history, Satan wants to ride over and oppress and exploit for his own advantage. It's the exact opposite of a serving God who humbled himself in the form of a servant to uplift and give of himself. And what happens when we do this? The masses become injured or damaged. And this is the form of every human government. What did the people want? Why did they want this? It said it in the text. According to text, they wanted this so they could be like the other nations.
It's fashionable.
What did Jesus say about the kingdoms of the world? His kingdom is not of this world. But they want the gold, and the golden age is like the world. This isn't God's kingdom. This isn't God's design. They didn't want God's methods. They wanted to be like the world. And what did it get them? Do you see how this process of the people requesting to have a government like the world was an attack on God's plan by Satan to bring in the methods and principles of exploitation, domination, control, imperialism that damage and destroys the image of God in people and thereby harden hearts? In fact, what happened to the leadership once they had kings? Who led them into false worship of false gods over and over again? It was these kings, this aristocracy over and over again, leading them into paganism. They never became a nation of priests to evangelize the world and prepare the world for Messiah, because they became like the world and became elitists and self-centered nationalists, exclusivists.
A top-down government, not a bottom-up.
That's right. So in this so-called golden age, we find the great controversy is again being played out with Satan subverting God's plan with his own imperial law methods. God's plan was for the people to be the kingdom of priests and go out and share the world. Now consider what we saw in the wilderness after he leads them out of Egypt. Contrast the difference when God was the actual king that they were following in the wilderness. God provided food for them. They did not have to plant and give their food to the king. God is giving them manna every day and providing food for them. God provided water for them. God sustained their clothing so it didn't wear out. They didn't have people making clothing for the king and taking taxing. God provided good health so they didn't get sick.
Shade in the daytime.
Shade in the daytime.
And light at night.
And light and heat at night, yes. God was giving of himself to support and provide for their health and welfare. He instructed them only on those instructions which were good for their character. So, he instructed them to bring offerings to support the tabernacle. Gold, silver, the mirrors, etc. But for what purpose? That he asked for these offerings because he needed them to uplift him, to build him up, to enrich him, to do good for him in some way. No. This is part of his plan of salvation. It was for their character development. They needed to practice God's methods they need to engage or put God's methods into practice. That's how you get better at something. So you develop skill at something. And so they needed to become givers, not takers. They need to open the channels of love. They need to participate by action. They need to commit themselves and invest their energies in the purpose of God. And so this is why he had them bring offerings, not because he needed them.
Because that's how life's designed to operate.
That's
the law of giving,
there
the
you
law
go.
of worship, the law of love, the law of exertion.
And that's what we do here at Come and Reason Ministries. And many of you participate with that, and you know the blessings of that. The various regulations he set up were not for God's benefit, or to control or to dominate, but for the health and protection of the people and help them mature and grow up, to lead them to ever-increasing character development. This is what was happening. But what did they do? They rejected God's plan and God's methods and substituted their own. What do we see? We see God's patience, God's love, God's mercy, God's grace, who meets them where they are in order to lead them where he would like them to be. So the point of the lesson is to establish King David and King Solomon as real people who lived in real times, and there is archaeological evidence to support them as real historic figures. We have no dispute with that. And what would be the purpose? They asked the question. Very brief. It's very straightforward. What would be the purpose of arguing David never existed or he's a fictional character? Why would Satan try to put that lie out there? Because it ultimately is not a lie against David. It's a lie against his descendant, Jesus. Okay, and that's why, to undermine anybody's belief in the Messiah. If David never existed, then he couldn't have had a descendant who was the Messiah. Monday's lesson